Elliot Turner stood in the first-class boarding line, dressed simply. A flannel shirt, worn jeans and slightly scuffed boots. His appearance was in stark contrast to the polished elegance of the other passengers. Yet he seemed indifferent to his surroundings, carrying a backpack that spoke of countless journeys. Not far from him, a man named Victor Hardy observed him with disdain. Dressed in an impeccable suit and gleaming shoes, Victor exuded ostentatious confidence, his gaze betraying judgment. When their eyes met, Victor couldn't resist a sarcastic remark. "First class, huh? You see all kinds here." Elliot calmly replied, "Yes, life is full of surprises." The simple, unresentful response caught Victor off guard, who had expected to provoke more. Shortly after, the two men boarded the plane and fate placed Elliot beside Victor. Visibly annoyed, Victor seized the opportunity to continue his jabs. He inquired about Elliot's profession, convinced it didn't align with first-class standards. Elliot's reply, "I work in the film industry," triggered another wave of condescension from Victor. Throughout the flight, however, Elliot maintained his composure, responding to provocations with wisdom and simplicity. Gradually, his poised demeanor began to chip away at Victor's assurance, sparking unexpected reflections among the passengers and prompting a profound re-evaluation in Victor himself. This flight would mark a turning point in both their lives. The Los Angeles airport buzzed with its usual chaos. Overhead announcements, lively conversations, and the constant rumble of rolling suitcases. Amid the clamor, Elliot Turner stood still in the first-class check-in line. Unlike the opulence surrounding him, his attire was disarmingly simple. A plaid shirt, jeans that had clearly seen better days, and boots worn down by time. His travel-weary backpack hinted at stories far richer than his appearance suggested. His calm stood in contrast to the frenzy around him. While others bustled, checked their tickets, or chatted loudly, Elliot remained serene, savoring the moment. Those who paused to notice him might sense a quiet aura, a tranquility impervious to the surrounding commotion. But he wasn't entirely invisible. Behind him, Victor Hardy, a man of impeccable appearance, couldn't help but scrutinize him with disdain. Adjusting his tailored suit and smoothing imaginary wrinkles from his pristine trousers, Victor let out a condescending sigh. He was the type who valued appearances as much as the labels on luggage, and Elliot stood out too much to escape his critical gaze. Despite the scrutiny, Elliot didn't react. His serenity seemed unshakable, immune to external judgments. This silent clash between two contrasting worlds would soon ignite an unexpected exchange with far-reaching consequences. Those who shifted their attention away from the crowd to observe Elliot Turner more closely could sense that he wasn't responding to anyone else. It wasn't just his simplistic attire or his travel-worn backpack. It was his calm, an almost palpable serenity, that set him apart from the general frenzy. While everyone else fidgeted, checked devices, or made last-minute calls, Elliot simply watched as if seeing beyond the chaos, absorbing every detail with a peaceful gaze. He appeared unfazed by the stark contrast between his appearance and that of the other passengers. Curious glances or subtle whispers slid off him like water off a stone. Elliot carried an aura that seemed to say, "I have nothing to prove." This detachment made him intriguing to those who took the time to notice. Behind him in line, Adrian Miller, a man who never went unnoticed, was his polar opposite. Dressed in a luxurious, perfectly tailored suit, his polished shoes gleamed under the airport lights. His subtly showcased watch seemed designed to announce his belonging to a higher social echelon. Adrian wasn't the type to let anything escape his notice, let alone someone who, by his standards, didn't belong. As he distractedly adjusted his tie, Adrian glanced at Elliot with a barely perceptible sneer. He didn't need to say a word to convey his judgment. But Elliot, true to his usual calm, remained indifferent. This silent contrast between the two men was about to take an unexpected turn. Elliot slowly turned his head toward Adrian, his gaze piercing yet tranquil. He didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch between them like a taut string that only Adrian seemed inclined to cut. The latter, slightly unsettled by the lack of immediate reaction, raised an eyebrow, perhaps expecting justification or dialogue that never came. "Well," Adrian said with a hint of insistence, "I suppose everyone's entitled to a little luxury, even if it's out of place." His voice was syrupy, but the underlying contempt was unmistakable. Elliot offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile, a mix of amusement and indifference. "You know," he finally replied, his voice calm and measured, "luxury isn't always about what you wear or show. Sometimes it's what you carry within." Adrian was caught off guard, but before he could respond, the intercom announced the imminent boarding of first-class passengers, cutting their exchange short. The two men moved forward in line, Adrian casting furtive glances at Elliot, as if trying to decipher a code that eluded him entirely. Elliot moved at an unhurried pace, his gaze still serene. He took his seat not far from Adrian, who continued to steal discreet glances in his direction. What would unfold over the next few hours, however, would put an end to these silent comparisons and forever change how they perceived one another. As Adrian prepared to add another comment, a flight attendant approached to check passengers' tickets. "Gentlemen, welcome aboard. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to let me know." Her professional smile contrasted sharply with the palpable tension between the two men. Elliot responded with a slight nod and settled into his seat, pulling a worn book from his backpack. He opened it to a page marked by a folded corner and immediately immersed himself in its contents, completely ignoring Adrian. Adrian, on the other hand, seemed unable to take his eyes off Elliot. The man wasn't particularly remarkable, and yet something about his detached attitude unsettled him. Perhaps it was because Elliot didn't fit into any of the boxes Adrian was used to checking. Or maybe it was because he wasn't reacting the way Adrian had expected. The plane took off shortly after, and silence filled the cabin, interrupted only by the gentle hum of the engines and the occasional clinking of silverware. Despite himself, Adrian continued to steal glances at Elliot, who remained absorbed in his book, impervious to the luxury around him or Adrian's pointed stares. It wasn't until the flight attendant returned with drinks that Adrian, unable to contain his curiosity, broke the silence again. "So what's your secret?" he asked, a sly grin playing on his lips. Elliot slowly lifted his eyes from the book, a hint of amusement flickering in them. "My secret? Not burdening myself with what others think," he replied. The words hung in the air, leaving Adrian speechless for the first time that evening. Elliot, calmly tucking his backpack under the seat in front of him, looked up at Adrian with an almost imperceptible smile. "They say fate works in mysterious ways." His tranquil response seemed to irritate Adrian further, who slouched into his seat with an exaggerated sigh, crossing his legs. As the crew announced the safety protocols, Adrian, unable to keep quiet, turned to Elliot. "So what's your story? Are you some kind of writer chasing inspiration or a hermit philosopher?" His words dripped with sarcasm, accompanied by a smirk. Elliot shrugged. "Maybe both. Maybe neither." He then reopened his book to the marked page, clearly signaling the end of the conversation. Frustrated, Adrian grabbed the drinks menu and ordered an expensive cocktail. "Want something?" he asked, a hint of challenge in his tone. Elliot gently shook his head. "No thank you. Water will do." Elliot's simple, disinterested demeanor seemed to baffle Adrian, who couldn't help but search for a way to crack the man's impenetrable exterior. As the meal service began, Adrian tried again. "You know, it's rare to see someone in first class who doesn't care at least a little about luxury. Did you win this ticket in a lottery or something?" Elliot closed his book and fixed his gaze on Adrian, this time with a touch of firmness. "True wealth is knowing what really matters. Everything else is just appearances." Caught off guard, Adrian fell silent, mulling over Elliot's words. For the first time he wondered if this journey might offer more than just physical comfort. The flight ascended smoothly. Adrian, unable to keep still, watched Elliot from the corner of his eye. This man intrigued him despite himself. How could someone remain so calm, so detached in an environment designed to impress? As the in-flight service began, Adrian spoke again, almost involuntarily. You must have a reason for being here. Business trip? Or maybe some kind of spiritual retreat? Elliot lifted his eyes from a notebook he'd been writing in with fluid strokes. Neither. Just a journey. Adrian seized on the ambiguity. Just a journey? He chuckled softly, leaning closer. People don't fly first class for just a journey. There's always a reason, a purpose. Elliot closed his notebook and met Adrian's gaze with surprising intensity. Maybe the journey itself is the purpose. Maybe some people aren't here to impress or prove anything. Those words shook Adrian's confidence. He opened his mouth to respond but found no words. For a fleeting moment he was faced with a perspective he'd never considered. The silence that followed was broken by the flight attendant offering dessert. Elliot chose a simple tea, while Adrian selected the most elaborate option on the menu, as if to reassert his superiority. But with every bite, Adrian couldn't help but glance at Elliot, whose disarming composure made all his efforts feel hollow. This flight promised to be more enlightening than Adrian had anticipated. Elliot seemed unfazed by Adrian's remarks and calmly replied, "Perhaps. But sometimes the ones underestimated are the ones who surprise everyone." Adrian's tongue pushed further. "Oh, you mean like those dreamers who think they'll one day reach for the stars?" He leaned slightly forward, his smile as condescending as ever. "Tell me, who do you work for? Some small local company? Or are you still chasing your big project?" Elliot paused for a moment as if weighing his response. "I've worked on a few projects. But honestly, I prefer to keep things low-key." That answer unsettled Adrian. Elliot's quiet confidence was beginning to make him uncomfortable. He had expected his neighbor to justify himself or at least try to impress him, but nothing of the sort happened. The flight attendant passed by, offering drinks. Elliot opted for water, while Adrian requested an overpriced whiskey. Sipping his drink, Adrian continued to study Elliot, searching for cracks in his serene demeanor. Finally, he took a more direct approach. "Look, I'm not saying this to be mean, but I bet you're still struggling to prove yourself, right? The big names in this field don't leave much room for outsiders." Elliot calmly set his glass down. "Maybe. But sometimes outsiders create their own space." Adrian shrugged, unable to respond, yet intrigued despite himself. A part of him was beginning to wonder if this man whom he had so easily judged, had more depth than he was willing to admit. As the attendants bustled about, handing out menus and taking initial orders, Adrian, still intent on showcasing his superiority, loudly commented on the wine list, mentioning a vintage he had enjoyed at a Michelin-starred restaurant in Paris. Elliot simply requested a plain coffee, thanking the flight attendant with a smile. The contrast between the two men was stark. Adrian, clearly preoccupied with the image he projected, and Elliot, perfectly comfortable in his simplicity. Yet Adrian couldn't resist keeping the conversation going. "So, do you often travel in first class, or is this just a little indulgence for once?" Adrian demanded, his tone half curious, half sarcastic. Elliot glanced up at him, taking a sip of his coffee before replying, "Depends on the destination. Sometimes you don't have a choice." Adrian narrowed his eyes, intrigued by the enigmatic answer. "No choice? What does that mean?" "That some things in life aren't always up to us," Elliot replied, offering no further explanation. A tense silence settled between them, broken only by the sound of the plane gaining altitude. Frustrated at not getting more information, Adrian switched tactics. "You said you work in film, right? Have you worked on anything I'd know?" Elliot set his coffee down and looked him directly in the eye. "Probably yes. But I prefer to let my work speak for itself." The response unsettled Adrian, who for the first time, faced a mystery he couldn't quite crack. For a moment silence reigned. Adrian, still determined to assert social dominance, studied Elliot with a gaze full of inner judgment. "You're quite the anomaly, aren't you? I'm curious. What makes you think this simplicity, this laid-back attitude will help you carve out a place here?" Elliot, his eyes fixed on the scenery visible through the window, took a light breath. He slowly turned his head toward Adrian, his gaze calm but penetrating. "I believe the place we occupy is never really about appearances or status." Adrian raised an eyebrow, unsettled by the simplicity and depth of Elliot's answer. He had expected an ego clash, but each time, Elliot responded with an insight that brushed against a truth Adrian didn't want to confront. "And you seriously think your place here isn't determined by your wallet or your job, by your ability to impress?" Adrian pressed on, still skeptical. Elliot smiled, a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Let's just say the key is being comfortable with who you are no matter where you are." Adrian frowned. He felt as though the wall he'd built around himself was cracking with every word Elliot uttered. The man wasn't even trying to compete, he just seemed at peace. The service interrupted their exchange. Adrian focused on his champagne, trying to mask his growing irritation, while Elliot sipped his coffee, serene as ever. The dynamic between them remained clear, yet for the first time, Adrian began to doubt it. As the plane leveled out and stabilized, a heavy silence hung between the two men. Adrian, increasingly annoyed by Elliot's indifference, tried to pry further. "Tell me, do you have any interesting projects right now?" he demanded with a forced smile, attempting to steer the conversation. "You seem like someone who might accomplish something great. Or not?" Elliot, as calm as ever, paused before responding. "I have a few projects, but I'd rather not talk about what I do." His voice was steady, carrying an undeniable wisdom. Frustrated by the evasive answer, Adrian tried to press the issue. "You know, in the film industry you really have to know how to sell yourself. Talent isn't always enough. You need a network." He shrugged as if to imply he spoke from experience. "I suppose you already know that, right?" Elliot turned to look at him, this time with a slight smile that conveyed no arrogance, only a hint of amusement. "Maybe for some, selling is the priority. But for others, authenticity comes first." It was a quiet but sharp blow. Adrian suddenly felt off balance. He had expected a quicker, more predictable response aligned with his way of judging people, but Elliot seemed to be teaching him a lesson he hadn't anticipated. Elliot's gaze remained steady, and for the first time since their encounter began, Adrian was left speechless, unsettled by Elliot's calm serenity.